Okay, welcome to our Erev Shabbat Parashat class, Parashat Kitisa, and this week Parashat Parah as well. And why speak about the cow? That's what we're going to focus on this week, rather than our normal actual Parashat discussion. The additional, what we call Parashat, the additional reading known as Parashat Parah, which is the third of four additional readings that Hachamim instituted before from the period of time prior to Purim to the period of time prior to the holiday of Pesach. There is an added reading called Parashat Parah, which essentially is from the beginning of Parashat Chukat. We read the first 23 Pesukim. This segment, as we call it a parasha, deals with all the laws of the Parah Adumah. When one is contracted impurity from in being in contact with or the vicinity of a deceased, then one has to, when one has to purify himself. The only way to do so is to go through a process in which one would, by the direction of a Kohen, would have water mixed with the ashes of a paraduma red heifer that was burnt, and mixed with sheni tolad ve'ezob, mixed with a few other ingredients, and have it sprinkled on him the third and seventh day of his impurity. And of course, afterwards, he would dip in a mikveh tahora in the waters, the ritual waters, and then become tahor, then be pure. So we read this segment from Parashat Chukat called Parashat Parah, based on the Parah Adumah, the red heifer. Usually in the Shabbat immediately following Purim, as it falls out this year. And it's the third of the additional added segments that Hachamim gave us. What we'd like to do in this brief class is to talk about the background of this reading, this extra reading, and at the end, draw a few comparisons, well, really address a critical issue and draw at least one comparison to our actual Parashat Kitisa and glean a very critical message from that and from another reason that we'll provide. So here we go. It all starts from the Mishnah. The Mishnah Masechet Megillah, the fourth chapter, Masechet Megillah, Daf Kaftet, page 29, enumerates and describes these four extra readings. And the Mishnah says, I quote, Bashirishit, the third reading, Parah Adumah. That's all the Mishnah says. The Gemara specifically identifies where the reading is from. So why is it that Hachamim did this? So the Abu Darham explains to let people know. It's an indicator for people. This, by the way, these extra parashiot were added all the way from Ezra Sofer. This is an age-old tradition or practice, really, that we have to read this extra reading besides the reading of the week. And it was an indicator, it was a reminder to everyone who is present, everyone who hears the reading, that, hey, listen, the month of Nisan is upon us. And amongst you, there may be many people that are teme'eh metim, that have contracted impurity. If you're a Kohen, you don't really have to be careful about this the rest of the year. Having contracted impurity from being in the vicinity of a deceased. And now that you're going up to make Aliyah to Yerushalayim, and you're going to be in contact with the Korban Pesach, which is your obligation as an adult Jew, and to actually eat it on the 9th or the 14th of Nisan. So you have to be physically ready, and of course, you can say metaphysically ready in the purification process. You are right now tameh. You're defiled, and you have to be pure. You're not allowed to be in contact. So you have to go through this Parah Adumah process. And the reminder for everyone is reading the segment prior to the month of Nisan. That'll buffer, give you some time. Just put it on your calendar, fit it into your schedule, and know that the time is coming very soon. And by the way, the actual Korban was chosen earlier than the Korban Pesach, obviously, which was the 14th of Nisan. It was chosen from earlier in the month. So people really had to get their acts together, and that says the Abu Darham, Rabbi Levi Abu Darham, student of the Rosh, the great Hacham, uh, late 13th century Hacham, who gave us reasons for many of the mitzvot and readings and practices explained this way. So it's a very practical reason for the institution of this reading by Hachamim. The Tur codifies this, the halacha, but then it gets interesting. The Bet Yosef, Maran Rabbi Yosef Karo, with his great, incredible work that starts with, the springboard starts with the Tur, quotes the Tosafot. The Tosafot is from Masechet Berachot, Daf Yud Gimel, page 13a. And there, the Tosafot, and this is a little out of context, this quote, but says that there are parashiot, there are, in other words, additional readings, that are muhuyabim l'kro midoraita, that have a Torah level obligation, and he says, Kimo Parashat Zachor u Parashat Parah Aduma. The Bet Yosef quotes this Tosafot, and we stand a little bit in, if not in shock, at least in extreme surprise that the Tosafot made this comment. We know, it's very popularly accepted, that Parashat Zachor, as directed in the Torah at the end of Parashat Kiteseh Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek. Remember, at the end of those three Pesukim, Al Tishkach, the Mizvah Lo Ta'aseh, that in our minds we should never forget Amalek and what he did to us. And then there's a positive commandment, Zachor. We list this as a positive, one of the 248 positive commandments in the Torah, to actually, actively, verbally remember the evil of Amalek. And we do so. We actually did so last week by adding this little parasha, the segment, these three pesukim from Parashat Kiteseh after the parasha of the week as the maftir reading. And we all have in mind, of course, we can fulfill that anytime during the course of the year, that the Hachamim instituted to do it right before, fulfill this right before Purim because of the obvious connection. Haman was the descendant of Amalek. And that's when we fulfill the mitzvah. We have in mind we're fulfilling mitzvah aseh, positive commandment from the Torah, and that's Parashat Zachor. But in the same breath, Tosafot, as quoted by the Bet Yosef, says, as well as Parashat Parah Aduma. And we are at a loss. Where, why, how does Parashat Parah Aduma, which seemingly is just words, it's not actions, and as opposed to Amalek, that we have an obligation to actually remember something by verbalizing it, by declaring it, there's no remembering obligation. Parashat Parah is another mitzvah in the Torah. We read it in Parashat Chukat. There are many laws. There's the whole Masechet Mishnah that deals with the laws of the red heifer and that whole process. Fine. But what does the reading have to do with it? Why would the reading of it, and today we don't have this process anymore, why would the reading of it be a positive commandment from the Torah? And the Bet Yosef doesn't say. However, indeed, in the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo codified as law. He says, Yesh Omrim, some say. We know the rule is, when there is no opposing opinion, and Maran frames something as a Yesh Omrim, some say it is actually the law. And he says, Shulchan Aruch, this is Siman Tafresh Peh, chapter 685 in Shulchan Aruch Orach Hayim, he says, Yesh omrim sheparashat Zachor uparashat Parah Aduma hayavim nekrotam midoraita. The Torah obligation, not only to read Parashat Zachor, but also the additional reading of Parashat Parah from Chukat is also a Torah obligation. He says, therefore, if you live in an outer little town that doesn't have a minyan, make sure to make arrangements to make a minyan for that reading that week. He leaves it at that. And that seems to be, as actually printed in the text of Shulchan Aruch, an obligation now. It's codified as Jewish law. In other words, of course, we are going to read Parashat Parah, but the difference is our kavanah, having intent to fulfill a Torah law, maybe having to ask women to come to the knis as well, maybe other ramifications. If you missed it, or the consequences, etc. It's a big deal. And the Mefarshim and the poskim that follow Shulchan Aruch have a lot to say about this. And indeed, as Hakam Avodah Yosef is a long discussion on it, there's many poskim and Mishnah Berurah, others bring it down, discuss it way before Hakam Avodah. Many poskim and authorities since then, the last 500 years, disagree. Some vehemently disagree with Shulchan Aruch and say it's not. And the truth is that there's something behind this, and it has to do with the Tosafot and the Girsah, the right version of Tosafot. Many Tosafot, of course, founded by Rabbi Tam, the grandson of Rashi, in the 12th century, and a school of academy of Talmud that lasted for about 100 years. Many different Hachamim in Tosafot. However, there in this particular Tosafot, there is a different version of it that omits the words Parashat Parah. It only has the words Parashat Zachor, and thus the beginning of this controversy, so to speak. And many argue. That said, we have it in Shulchan Aruch. Us, the Sfaradim especially, must adhere to this, seemingly. So the big question is why? How is Parashat Parah? Can it possibly be a Torah mitzvah? I'm going to present two theories, two possible approaches from great poskim, and I think great profound lessons can be gleaned from both of these approaches. One which ties right back to the parasha that we're reading this week, which is Ki Tisa. So the first one is from the Aruch HaShulchan, the great Rabbi Epstein of the 19th century. And he first brings the fact that great later authorities after Shulchan Aruch were very surprised and shocked at this statement. Chief amongst them, the great Magen Avraham. And he says, but I think I found the answer. And that indeed that there is a hint to this in the actual Torah. He points out that Parashat Parah, again, is in Chukat. He points out in the beginning of Parashat Chukat, this is Bemidbar, Perek Yutet, chapter 19, Pasuk Tet, verse 9. It says, Here's the punchline, this latter half of the pasuk. Actually, I wanted to read the next pasuk Yud. So I'll get to the latter half of that pasuk. I'm sorry. Now, Chok is the category, of course, Parah Adumah is categorized in. It's the ultimate Chok, law without given reason. But the Torah here says Chokat Olam, which sounds like an eternal law. An eternal law. So the Aruch HaShulchan explains that is to teach us that even after the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed and there was no practice in the temple and there was no korbanot, but we still were left with some leftover, actual preserved Parah Adumah ashes, and therefore the potential to continue that ceremony. And from this pasuk, the Midrash learns that this mitzvah can be practiced for generations to follow and was not dependent on the existence of the temple. And in fact, during later centuries, even during the Hakamim of the Gemara, the Amoraim, it was practiced. Okay, fine. We ran out, suffice it to say. So there's no ashes left. But then he says, if you look further in Pasuk Kaf Aleph, verse 21 of the same chapter, in Parashat Chukat, it says yet again, V'hayata lahem lechukat olam. The phrase is repeated. He says that was completely superfluous and unnecessary. And he says that perhaps is to teach us that even at a time that the actual red heifer ashes do not exist, and therefore we're prevented, it is out of our reach and capabilities from fulfilling that mitzvah, that there's still an obligation upon us to somehow engage in this mitzvah. How? To read the chapter or the Pesukim or the Parasha, the segment in the Torah that deals with this law. And he says, all the more so at a day and time in our day when we don't have the ability to practice it, we must read it. Okay, it's a fascinating idea. And this is the Aruch HaShulchan. This is pretty recent in history, coming up with a theory as to why it could be Torah law to read this. Allow me to frame this a little bit. Allow me to frame this. We know that Parashat Dumah uses the paradigm as the ultimate model of what a chok is in the Torah, because it's the most enigmatic, the most mysterious law that we have. Shlomo HaMelech alav Shalom said in Kohelet, "Amarti hkama v'hu rechokam mimeni." I searched and I engaged in all realms of wisdom and chokhmah and knowledge, in the great depths of understanding of the universe and of God. I explored everything. And I said, I can do it. I can beat it. I can overcome it. I can understand the depths and the mystery of Parah Adumah. It's beyond me, says Shalom. It's impossible. And we have this mitzvah, therefore, that we practice without really understanding it, having almost any understanding of it. Shlomo Muhammad couldn't understand it. It's this esoteric commandment that we have. And yet we have this idea that such a law is always present. And it almost becomes a model for another concept. And that is that the Torah HaKadoshah, we think sometimes that, listen, the Hachamim, Havetz Hayim, list for us over 300 mitzvot that can't be practiced. More than half of the mitzvot in the Torah can't be practiced today. We're bereft of mitzvot. We're not really authentic Jews, right? We're not really, okay, we're waiting for to practice many others that we can't. But that does not leave the Torah deficient. The Torah lives, transcends times, beyond limitations, historical limitations of the nation that observes the Torah. Torah continues to exist. And the model for that idea is this esoteric law that sort of hovers over us in a cloud. And despite the fact that we're not physically engaging it, the recitation of its Pesukim reminds us that it's alive and well and with us. And that perhaps is the law that teaches us this lesson by being commanded to read about it no matter what. That's one possible theory. Here's the other one. There's a responsa called Aruchat HaBosan. Acham Vodei Yosef quotes it. And in that response, he brings up this issue and this controversy. And he quotes a Hacham who authored a sefer called Yismach Moshe. And he reminds us that in Parashat Ha'egel, which means that we know that this past week we read about Het Ha'egel, the sin of the golden calf in Parashat Ki Tisa. Later in the Torah, in Parashat Ekev, Moshe Rabbeinu refers to reflecting back on that episode once again. And I'll just interject here for a moment, and you can see it as she in the Parashat and Parashat Chokat speak about this, that there are so many details and so many specifications in the laws of Parah Adumah that reflect Het HaEgel in an opposite manner. In other words, there is symmetry with the practice and the numbers and the ingredients, etc., etc. But it comes to negate. We're not going to go through them now. But suffice it to say that the practice of the purification practice of the red heifer and its ashes and its mixture and its sprinkling and the entire ritual comes to atone for, so to speak, and negate the sin of Het HaEgel. Okay, that known. So again, this Hakam Arugat HaBosan, quoting the Yismach Moshe, says as follows. In Maaseh HaEgel, referring to Parashat Ekev in the Torah, this is Devarim, Perek Tet, chapter 9, Pasuk Zayin, verse 7. Moshe Rabbeinu warns the people, and he says, Zechor, al tishkach, et asher ksafta et Adonai Elohecha b'midbar. Remember, don't ever forget, and this was in the context of the Het HaEgel episode reminding us of, how much you angered God in the desert. And we know that when it says Zachor in the Torah, very often it's a positive commandment. Amalek, right? Parashat Zachor. We don't Kiddush. Zachor, Yom Shabbat Kadeshot. Everyone agrees, it's unanimous. Kiddush, Leil Shabbat, Mitzvah min Torah. The Rambam does not count all of them. Therefore, he doesn't count this one as a positive commandment. The Ramban does. He says every Zachor is a positive commandment. And therefore, according to some opinions, and there are those who agree with him, that this Zachor is a positive commandment to remember somehow how we angered God with Het HaEgel, with the sin of the golden calf. How do you do that? By reciting it. Now, says this great Hakam, Arugat HaVosim, quoting the Ismach Moshe, that Hachamim didn't want us, because it would be a bizayon, disgrace to Am Yisrael, to recite in public. We have to do it in Parashat Kitisa. We have no choice. It's in the Torah. But to have a separate, individualized, self-contained reading of Het HaEgel to remind us of how much we angered God, it's a disgrace for Am Yisrael to keep repeating that low down, disgusting sin that we engaged in during those days. So instead, what Hachamim did is they took Parashat Parah Aduma in Parashat Hukat, which reflects and matches and aligns with and is symmetrical with and comes to negate and atone for the Het HaEgel. We read that instead, and with that, we fulfill the positive commandment of remembering how much we angered God with Het HaEgel. Amazing. Amazing. What an incredible theory. That's the reason, possibly, for reading the obligation, Torah obligation, possibly, for reading Parashat Parah. But I think from this, and of course, we've just attached and connected our Parashat Kitisa with Parashat Parah. And I think the lesson from this is one that many reasons and concepts that elevates Judaism from other realms of thought. And that is that we don't forget sin. We don't overlook sin. We don't cover it up. We don't brush it under the carpet. Says David HaMelech, Hatati nechdi tamid. My sin is always present. It's in my conscience. It's in the forefront of my mind all the time. Why? So that I feel bad and remorseful. I repent for it. That I never repeat it. I'm conscious of it. I won't fall in that pitfall again. And yet, with all that, the way we as Jews use sin is not as a form of, and remembrance of it, of depression, getting down on ourselves, feeling discouraged, losing confidence. Rather, we frame it in the positive. We take an egel, at the egel, we frame it in Parah Aduma. And we say the sin was there in retrospect, and it happened, but now I transform it. Now I become a positive person from it. Now I've grown. Now I've overcome. Now I take it to the next level. I'm a different person than before the sin. Because now I've tasted it, I reject it, I grew from it, and I took my life to the next level. So although Am Yisrael is a nation that has to remember their sinful past, to feel remorse and not to repeat. But when we remember a sin, we remember an egel and a golden calf, terrible iniquity. At the same time, we remember Parah Aduma. We frame it with the positive. We remember it by saying that we're a growing people, that we're a transforming people. And we never allow a transgression to take us down, only to build us and take us up. And therefore, Parah Aduma and not Parashat Het HaEgel. Baruch Adonai Olam. Amen v'amen. Shabbat Shalom.
So you say
5 minutes, Rabbi.